For 3 years, she had been invisible, and she had chosen it. Every dawn, Seren slipped past the royal boundary markers alone, climbing frozen cliff faces in the dark to harvest the one thing that kept her safe: ashveil moss, a silver plant that grew only in the Alpha King's territory, that erased her scent so completely that no Alpha could find her, claim her, or call her his. She had stolen from his land 100 times. He had never once stopped her. Until the morning he was standing on the cliff above her, watching, and she realized, with a cold that had nothing to do with the winter, that he had always known she was there. What does a king do when he finally decides to stop pretending he doesn't know your secret? Drop your answer in the comments, then stay with us, because what happens next will change everything you thought you knew about this story. The memory had teeth. Seren had learned over the years that it would find her at the worst possible moments, during the silence before sleep, during the hollow stretch of winter mornings when frost ferns grew across the window glass and the world outside lay still and indifferent. It came now, without warning, as she stood in the great washroom of the lodge, preparing for the ceremony she had dreaded since the day she first understood what it meant. She had been 12 years old. The great hall of her home pack had smelled of pine resin and burning herbs, a scent she could no longer encounter without her stomach turning to cold water. She had not been supposed to be there. Children were kept away from the bridal moon ceremony. But Seren had always been curious in the way that small animals are curious, creeping too close to things that could swallow them whole. She had pressed herself behind a carved pillar, breathless, watching through a crack in the wood. On the raised platform, a girl named Astrid knelt with iron cuffs at her wrists. Astrid had been 17, golden-haired, soft-spoken, the kind of girl the elders called blessed because the alpha males noticed her. Her heat had risen early that winter, and the elders had called it a gift. They had dressed her in white linen and braided flowers through her hair as though she were going to a festival. But Astrid's eyes had been wrong. Too wide, too bright. Not with joy, with fever. The scent of her heat had saturated the hall, something sweet and desperate and unbearably exposed. And the assembled alphas had stood in a loose circle with expressions Seren was too young then to name, but understood now with bone-deep certainty. Hunger without conscience. The elder spoke of honor, of destiny, of the moon's blessing. Astrid had wept. When the chosen alpha stepped onto the platform, Astrid had said one word: no. And the elder had kept speaking. The alpha had kept walking. And the hall had kept watching. When the bond bite came, Astrid's scream had shaken the candle flames and ricocheted off the stone walls, and the assembled crowd had called it beautiful. The moon has blessed her, they said afterward, to each other, to Seren's mother, to anyone who would listen. She is fortunate to be chosen. Seren had gone home that night and pressed her face into her sleeping furs, and understood two things with absolute, wordless clarity. The first, that she was an omega. She had known it distantly, the way one knows a storm is coming from the color of the sky, not yet arrived, but inevitable. The elders had not confirmed it yet, but her wolf had known, had always known. The second, that she would never stand on that platform. The solution had not come immediately. It had come 2 springs later, when Seren had followed the old healer woman, Vigdis, into the high cliffs above the settlement on one of her herb-gathering expeditions. Vigdis had been half-blind and entirely uninterested in conversation, which suited Seren perfectly. What had interested Seren was the strange, silver-green moss that clung to the rock face where the cliff curved inward, sheltered from wind and snow. Ashveil, Vigdis had called it, without being asked, as though she had expected the question. Grows only where the land is old, and Alpha claimed. Absorbs the power signature of the territory. Neutralizes everything it touches. She had said nothing more, but her clouded eyes had slid sideways to Seren with an expression that was not quite a smile and not quite a warning. Seren had begun harvesting it the following week. The moss had to be prepared, dried, ground to fine powder, then mixed with cold rendered fat and applied to the pulse points of the wrists, the throat, the inner arms. The effect lasted 3 days before it began to fade. The scent it left behind was nothing, not wolfsbane bitterness, not the sharp chemical emptiness of suppressant herbs, but genuine nothing, as though the person wearing it simply did not register. The elders had called her underdeveloped, a late bloomer, her wolf too quiet, her scent too faint to attract notice. She had let them believe it. For 6 years, she had let them believe it. The ashveil moss grew, as Vigdis had noted, in Alpha territory. In the high cliffs above Veldmark, the territory of the Northern Kingdom's royal pack, the territory of King Calder himself. Every 3 days, Seren had slipped past the boundary markers before dawn and climbed the cliff face alone to harvest what she needed, moving like smoke through the early dark. She had never been caught. She had seen him once, from a distance. A silhouette on the cliff's upper path at midwinter, dark against the gray sky, utterly still in the way that only truly powerful things could be still. She had pressed herself into the rock and held her breath for 7 minutes by count. He had not turned. He had not scented her. She had told herself this was evidence that the moss worked. She had not examined the other reason her heart had hammered quite so violently those 7 minutes. Now she was 18, and the bridal moon had come. Brynja found her still standing in front of the bronze mirror, the small clay pot of ashveil compound sitting open on the washstand beside her. "You've been staring at yourself for half an hour," Brynja said from the doorway. She was not Omega. She was Beta, blunt and warm and entirely unbothered by ceremony. She crossed the room and picked up the clay pot, turning it in her fingers. "Is this going to hold?" "I applied it fresh this morning. And the ceremony lasts until midnight." "I know." Brynja set the pot down and looked at Seren in the mirror. Really looked. The way only someone who had known you since childhood could look, finding all the places where the facade showed its seams. "You could simply not go," she said quietly. "An Omega of age who fails to present at the bridal moon is removed from pack protection." Seren's voice came out steadier than she felt. "You know that." "I know that Elder Hakon's interpretation of the law is not the only interpretation. It is the only one that matters until someone more powerful disagrees with him." She picked up her braid, winding it over her shoulder. Her fingers were perfectly steady. She had made herself practice stillness for years, the same discipline she used on cliff faces in pre-dawn dark, controlling each breath, each movement, making herself a small, unremarkable thing that did not merit attention. "I'll go. I'll stand in the hall for the required time. No alpha will mark me tonight." Brynja was quiet for a moment. Then, "The king will be there." Something moved through Seren's chest, a ripple, gone before she could name it. "The king comes to every bridal moon." She kept her voice even. "He never selects anyone. He's never scented his mate before." The words landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Seren met Brynja's eyes in the mirror and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not reveal more than she wished to reveal. Her wolf stirred at the base of her mind, slow and warm and annoyingly knowing. "Quiet," Seren told her. "Not tonight." The great hall of Veldmark's royal keep had been built to overwhelm. Seren understood this as she crossed the threshold with the other presenting Omegas, 24 young women in winter ceremony dress, pale wool and silver thread, hair unbound as tradition demanded. The hall swallowed them. Vast stone columns rose to a vaulted ceiling where iron chandeliers burned with enough candles to light a village. Tapestries covered the walls in deep blue and black, depicting the old battles of Calder's bloodline. The floor was smooth gray stone that carried sound like water. Every footstep, every whispered word, every rustled skirt echoed and returned. The assembled nobility filled the gallery above. Below, on the main floor, the alphas stood in a loose formation. 12 men from various packs who had traveled to Veldmark for the ceremony, along with the king's own court. Seren kept her eyes forward and her breathing deliberate. In through the nose, 4 counts. Out through the mouth, 4 counts. She had learned to move through crowds this way, occupying only the space she required, drawing nothing toward her. She found the king before she meant to. He was not in the center of the room. That was the first thing that registered, a detail that surprised her despite herself. The alphas of lesser packs had arranged themselves prominently near the central fire pit, the way men do when they want to be seen. Calder stood to the left of the high dais, slightly apart, speaking quietly to an older man she recognized as Lord Eirik of the Stormward Coast. A powerful alpha in his own right, gray at the temples, with a politician's careful eyes. The king had his back half turned. She had, in 6 years of pre-dawn trespassing, never been this close to him. He was... Her mind stalled, recalculated, tried again. He was very tall. That was the factual observation. Broad through the shoulder in the way of men who did not need to perform their strength because it was simply, evidently there, built into the frame of him. His hair was dark, nearly black, cropped shorter at the sides in the northern style, and he wore no crown tonight, only the deep charcoal wool of court dress with silver clasps at the wrist. He stood the way old mountains stand, like weather was a thing that happened around him, not to him. She looked away before he could turn. The ceremony began. The elder of Veldmark, a tall, hollow-cheeked man named Haken, who had always made Seren's wolf go very still and very watchful, took the central floor and began the traditional words. She had memorized them years ago. They were, she had always thought, beautiful in the way that certain knives are beautiful, elegant, purposeful, and designed entirely for one function. The moon recognizes her daughters. The bond recognizes its match. What is written in blood and breath shall be made whole. She breathed. In, out. She felt the ashveil compound sitting cool and settled against her skin. She had checked the application 3 times this morning. The alphas began to move through the hall. This was the part she had steeled herself for. The slow circulation, the deliberate inhaling, the assessment that dressed itself in ceremony but was, at its core, something older and more animal. She kept her chin level and her gaze slightly unfocused, looking at nothing and no one in particular. 2 alphas passed near her. Neither paused. 3 more, in a cluster. One glanced at her with mild attention, the polite interest one might give a tapestry, and moved on. It's holding, she thought. It's holding. It's fine. Keep breathing. Lord Eirik stopped directly in front of her. He was not young, but he was powerful, and he knew it. She could feel the particular weight of his presence, a deliberate pressure that well-trained alphas wielded like a tool. He studied her face for a moment that stretched uncomfortably long. "You're from the southern tributary pack," he said. Not a question. "Yes, my lord." "Your elder speaks highly of your qualities." His eyes moved over her with the calm calculation of a man assessing property. "You seem composed." "I try to be, my lord." He made a sound that might have been approval. Composure is valuable. Rarity is valuable. He leaned slightly closer, not close enough to be transgressive, close enough to be deliberate. "You wear an interesting absence, girl. My wolf finds you." He paused. "Intriguing. In the way of a puzzle." She felt her pulse stutter. He can almost sense it. The moss isn't hiding it. It's making me into a question mark. She kept her face smooth. "I'm afraid I don't understand, my lord." "No?" His gray eyes held hers for another moment. Then he smiled. Slow, certain. "You will." He moved on. Seren exhaled once, carefully. She did not notice that across the hall a pair of dark gray eyes had tracked the entire exchange. It was the cold that gave him away. Seren had pressed herself into a gap between 2 of the outer pillars, not hiding exactly, simply taking up less space, the way she had trained herself to do. And she was watching the fire in the central pit, and thinking about how much longer the required time was when she became aware of a drop in temperature that had nothing to do with the stone at her back. She turned her head. He was 4 feet away. King Calder of Veldmark stood with his shoulder against the pillar adjacent to hers, arms loose at his sides, watching a room. He was not looking at her. He showed no indication that he had been looking at her. And yet, he had somehow come to be standing exactly there, in the specific gap between the press of ceremony and the outer wall, the one piece of the hall where the crowd thinned and the noise softened. Seren became very still. His jaw was sharp from this angle. the bones of his face working in that precise Nordic geometry that the old sculptors liked to replicate in stone. All clean angles and deliberate planes. A thin scar ran along the left edge of his jaw, too old and well set to be from anything recent. His hands, she noticed involuntarily, were still. Not the stillness of effort, but the stillness of a man who had never needed to prove anything through motion. She should look away. She did not look away. "You are not enjoying this," he said. His voice, this close, was lower than it carried across a hall. She felt it more than heard it, a resonance that moved through the stone at her back. "I'm honored to attend, Your Majesty." A pause. "That was not what I said." She turned her face forward, watching the fire. "The ceremony is long," he said. "Cold. Designed, I have always suspected, more for the comfort of the watching nobility than the comfort of anyone actually required to participate." He did not look at her either. He might have been speaking to the room. "You have been standing in that particular gap for 40 minutes. She processed this. "You noticed." "I noticed most things." She considered several responses and discarded all of them. Beside her, he shifted his weight fractionally. Not toward her, not away, simply a small recalibration, and she became intensely aware of the heat that radiated from him despite the cold of the hall. Alpha warmth was always higher than average. His seemed unreasonable, like standing next to a forge. She had spent 6 years on cold cliff faces before dawn. She had made herself immune to cold. She was, she noted with distant alarm, not cold. "Lord Eric spoke with you," Calder said. "Yes." "What did he want?" She glanced at him sideways, unable to stop herself. He was still watching the room, his profile unreadable. "I'm not sure, Your Majesty. He is looking for a bond. He has been looking for 3 bridal moons. He is not a gentle man." The words were simple. They carried something underneath them that she could not entirely categorize. Not quite a warning, not quite a claim. Something between the two, still formless. "I will take care of myself," she said quietly. His gaze moved to her then, the first time he had looked at her directly. She had expected, she did not know what she had expected, assessment perhaps. The same calculating regard she had seen from every alpha tonight. His eyes were dark gray, the color of the sky an hour before snow. They rested on her face for one long, unhurried moment, and she had the distinctly unnerving sensation that he was not looking at her face, but through it, searching for something she had not put there for finding. "Yes," he said, "I believe you will." He pushed off the pillar and walked away, moving through the crowd with the particular quality of stillness that the most powerful people carried with them. The room parting not because he demanded it, but because the room simply adjusted itself around him, the way rivers adjust around stone. Seren pressed the back of her hand against her sternum and felt her heart knocking against her palm. Her wolf raised her head. "Don't," Seren thought at her. Her wolf said nothing, but she did not lie back down. 3 nights later, the compound was nearly gone. She woke before dawn and lay in the dark of the lodge room she'd been given for the ceremony week, running calculations. The moss needed to be harvested, prepared, applied before morning. The nearest ashveil site was the eastern cliff face, 40 minutes on foot from the keep walls, 20 minutes of climbing, 10 minutes of harvesting if she was efficient. She was out of the lodge before first light touched the sky. The forest between the keep and the cliffs was old pine and black rock, the snow here packed to ice under the trees, and she moved through it quickly, breath clouding, her worn fur-lined boots finding the old footholds she had mapped over years of this same journey. Her wolf was alert at the base of her mind. This close to alpha-claimed territory, her instincts sharpened. She did not mind. Sharpened instincts helped. The cliff face emerged from the trees as the sky began to gray. She had her small harvesting knife and her linen carry sack, and she found the familiar handholds in the rock face and began to climb. The ashveil was higher than she expected. The recent snowfall had covered the lower patches. She climbed another 15 feet before the silver-green moss appeared in a long shelf on the sheltered side of an outcropping, beaded with ice crystals that caught the pre-dawn light. She was harvesting, her knife working quickly along the edge of the growth, when she heard it. Footsteps. On rock, above her. She pressed herself flat against the cliff face. Her knife went still. Her breathing stopped. A long, slow moment. Then a voice, from perhaps 20 feet above and to the left. "You are trespassing." Her heart performed a complicated maneuver against her ribs. She looked up. King Calder stood on the upper path, looking down at her with an expression she could not read from this angle. Only the outline of him against the lightening sky, dark and absolutely, terrifyingly still. He was dressed for early morning movement, not ceremony. Plain dark wool, no court adornment. His hair slightly disordered from what she suspected was a pre-dawn patrol. He looked, without the formal context of the hall, precisely as dangerous as she had always understood him to be. "Your Majesty," she said, because there was nothing else to say. "That cliff face is within the royal boundary markers." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "You have been warned twice by my border wardens in the past season." Twice. Her breath came out slowly. She had been warned twice. She had ignored the warnings twice, operating on the theory that a border warden's warning and the king's personal attention were entirely different categories of risk. She was currently revising this theory. "I will leave immediately," she said. "Come up first." "You'll fall if you try to descend from that handhold in a hurry. I've watched 3 men attempt it." She tilted her head back to look at him again. He was not joking, she realized. He was making a practical observation. Slowly, she climbed up instead of down, following the path of least resistance up the rock face, until she reached the ledge below his position and pulled herself over the edge. She stood in the early gray light, her linen sack in one hand and her harvesting knife in the other, covered in rock dust and ice crystals, and looked up at the Alpha King of Veldmark, who was watching her with an expression that remained infuriatingly unreadable. He looked at the linen sack. He looked at the knife. He looked at her wrist, where the old application had faded to almost nothing. Something shifted in his face. Not much, but something. "Ashveil moss," he said. She said nothing. "It grows here because the stone holds the territory's frequency." His eyes moved back to her face, deliberate and unhurried. "It is not poisonous. It does not harm the wearer. It simply makes certain things invisible." The silence between them had weight and shape. She was the one who broke it, because she had learned long ago that controlled disclosure was safer than cornered silence. "Yes." "How long?" "Since I was 14. His jaw tightened. It was a small movement, the muscles along the bone, nothing more. His expression did not change. But she had spent years learning to read small things, and she read this one. Not anger at her, something older and directed elsewhere. "Come," he said, and turned and walked up the path, clearly expecting her to follow. She followed. There did not seem to be a reasonable alternative. He took her not to the throne room or the formal halls, but to a small room on the keep's western side. Stone walls, a low burning fire, a work table covered in maps and sealed letters that he swept to one side with a forearm to clear 2 spaces. He poured something from a ceramic jug into 2 cups without asking and set one in front of her. Warmed mead, she discovered when she picked it up. Honey-sweet and barely alcoholic, the kind given to travelers and night riders. She sat across the work table from him, her damp fur-lined boots dripping quietly onto the stone floor, her harvesting sack still over her arm, and waited. "The elders of your pack know what you are," he said. It was not a question. "They believe my development is delayed. They believe what you allowed them to believe." She held his gaze. "Yes." He leaned back in his chair. Not relaxed exactly, but settled. The way things settle when they are exactly where they have decided to be. His gray eyes were steady on her face. "You climb this cliff face, before dawn, in winter, every 3 days, by my warden's notes. He had the warden's notes. Of course he did. For 4 years within the royal boundary. Yes. Why not simply use suppressant herbs? They're available. She thought of Astrid, of iron cuffs and candle flames. She thought of the careful, deliberate way she had answered this question in her own mind, over years of cold dawn harvests. Suppressants leave a chemical trace, she said. Any alpha close enough knows you are suppressing something. It becomes its own advertisement. Ashveil leaves no trace. It simply removes the signal entirely. Leaves you as nothing. Leaves me as myself, she corrected, more sharply than she intended. Without the part that gets me treated as a resource. The fire popped. A log shifted, sending a small spray of sparks against the grate. He was looking at her differently now. She registered the change without being able to categorize it. The same quality of attention as in the hall, but stripped of the context of ceremony and court, it was more direct, more like weather than like assessment. I want to understand something, he said, and I am asking, not demanding. A deliberate emphasis on the distinction. What were you afraid would happen if you were found as you are? She set the cup down carefully. You were at the hall 3 nights ago. You saw how the ceremony works. I have been at that ceremony 11 times. And in 11 ceremonies, have you seen an Omega refuse? A long pause. No. Have you seen an Alpha be refused? No. Then you understand, she said, what the ceremony is. He was quiet for long enough that she became aware of the fire sound, the slow exhale of burning wood, and the particular quality of the silence between them, which was not the silence of 2 strangers waiting for conversation to end, but something else, something that had a texture to it. The bridal moon ritual, he said finally, has not changed in 200 years. He looked at the table, at the map spread across it, the territory of Veldmark outlined in old ink, borders and settlements and paths. I have been intending to change it. She stared at him. The proposal has sat in front of Elder Hakon's council for 3 sessions. His voice was controlled, but she heard something underneath it. The particular flatness of a man who had been patient for a long time and was running out of patience. They call it destabilizing. They call it a threat to the order of bonds. What does your proposal say? His eyes came back to her. That no Omega may be bonded without her stated, voluntary, witnessed consent. That any Alpha who attempts a bond bite without consent answers to the King's law. And that the ceremony should be a meeting, not an auction. She was very still. She thought of Victus, the half-blind healer woman, handing her knowledge without words. She thought of 14-year-old Seren, hands full of silver-green moss, making herself a promise on a cold cliff face. She thought of 6 years of pre-dawn harvests and 3-day counts and the careful, constant labor of being invisible. She thought of Astrid. Her throat tightened. Why are you telling me this? She managed. Because you looked at Lord Eric the way I look at Elder Hakon, he said. And because anyone who has spent 6 years climbing a cliff face at dawn to remain free deserves to know that someone else has noticed the problem. She looked down at the cup between her hands. Her reflection looked back at her from the dark surface of the mead, hair disheveled from the climb, cheeks flushed from cold and firelight, eyes wider than she would have preferred. The proposal, she said carefully. Does it pass? Not yet. His voice was dry. Elder Hakon is very committed to tradition. He would be. A pause, and then, to her considerable surprise, the corner of his mouth curved. It was not a full smile, it was the suggestion of one, a faint alteration at the edge of an otherwise still face. It lasted perhaps 1 second. It did something entirely unreasonable to her heartbeat. She stood up because she needed to be moving, needed to give her hands something to do. I should go before the household wakes. You can go through the inner corridor. It's drier. He rose as well and crossed to the fire room door, opening it. He was taller indoors than he had appeared against the cliff-edge sky, The low ceiling of the corridor reduced distance strangely, and she was aware, passing him in the doorway, that she had to tilt her head back to look at his face. She did not quite look at his face. Seren. He said her name for the first time. She did not remember telling it to him, but of course he would know it. He had the warden's notes. The sound of it in his voice did something she was not prepared for. If Eirik approaches you again, come to me. She stopped in the corridor. Why? Because his interest in you is not random. His expression was neutral. He has been asking questions about the late-blooming Omega from the Southern Tributary Pack for 2 seasons. I would prefer he not have the answers before you do. She turned this over. There was something in the sentence, the way it was structured, the direction the weight of it fell, that she did not entirely understand, but that her wolf understood with immediate, quiet certainty. Her wolf had, in fact, risen to all 4 feet and was standing with her ears very forward and her tail very still. Not now, Seren thought at her. Absolutely not now. I'll consider it, she said, and walked down the corridor and did not look back. She told herself her hands were cold from the climb. The cut happened on the 4th morning. She had gone back to the cliff face. She had no choice. The compound was fading and the ceremony week was not yet over. And this time, she climbed higher than usual to find an uncut section of moss, and she moved too quickly on a frost-slicked handhold, and she felt the rock edge catch the inside of her forearm as she caught herself, a line of pain that bloomed cold and then hot. She finished the harvest one-handed and made it back to the keep before she examined the damage. A clean cut, 2 inches long, along the soft underside of her forearm, bleeding steadily but not deeply. She wrapped it with a strip of her undershirt and told herself it was fine. It was fine. She was passing the fire room corridor when the door opened. You're bleeding. His voice, behind her. She stopped. It's minor. Your wrap is soaked through. He was already in the corridor, and she heard him moving toward her. Not quickly, not urgently, just approaching in the way of someone who has made a decision and will not be redirected by inconvenient protests. Come in. Your Majesty, really. Seren. Just that. Her name, with a particular quality of patience that was nearing its edge. Come in. She went in. He had her sit in the chair by the fire. Her chair, she had already begun to think of it, which was a dangerous tendency. And he brought a cloth and a small clay pot of sealing salve from the shelf behind the work table. He pulled the second chair close and sat facing her, and she extended her arm with the resigned dignity of someone who has lost a minor battle and is choosing to lose it gracefully. He unwrapped the makeshift bandage without comment. His hands were careful. She noticed this immediately and involuntarily. The way you notice a thing that contradicts your expectation. She had expected efficiency. She got care. He turned her arm gently in the firelight to see the cut clearly, and the contact of his warm hands against her cold forearm was a contrast she felt all the way up to her shoulder. She watched his face instead of the wound. He was focused. The same total attention she had seen him give to the maps on his work table, the same quality of presence that she suspected he brought to everything he did. There was a small furrow between his brows. His jaw was set. This close she could see that the gray of his eyes had a darker ring at the outer edge, the iris layered. And she remembered, suddenly, what the old pack stories said. An alpha's eyes change when he finds his mate. The gray goes gold. She looked away before he could look up and catch her looking. How often does this happen? He asked. First time. In 6 years of pre-dawn cliff climbing. I was careless. He made a sound that was not quite skeptical and not quite agreeable. He was cleaning the cut now, the cloth careful along the edges, and she kept her breathing even with some effort because the pain was manageable, but his hands were. She was paying too much attention to his hands. You should not have to do this, he said, quietly, almost to the wound rather than to her. I chose to. You chose it because the alternative was worse. He looked up then, directly, the way he had on the cliff, and she met his eyes because looking away would have been more telling than holding his gaze. There is a difference between a choice made freely and a choice made because all other options have been removed. She felt the words land somewhere in her chest and settle there, uncomfortable and exact. "The council," she said. "When do you think they'll pass the proposal?" He went back to the wound, applying the sealing salve, which was cold and then immediately warm, some old herb craft she didn't know. "Within the season, if I am patient enough." "I am not always patient enough." "You seem very patient." He glanced up. "I am controlled. The two things are not the same." She registered the difference without responding to it. Her wolf had registered it before she had, with a kind of attentive interest that she was firmly, deliberately ignoring. He finished with the salve and reached for a clean linen strip, and he wrapped her arm with the same care as everything else. No more tightly than necessary, the knot placed where it would not press against the inner wrist. When he was done, he held her forearm for a moment, not quite letting go, checking the bandage's tension with his thumb. She felt that point of contact like a point of heat in a cold room. He let go. She folded her arm back into her lap and occupied herself with not looking at the place where his hands had been. "I owe you for the moss," she said. "I have been trespassing for 4 years. "You owe me nothing." His voice was even. "The boundary is mine to enforce or not enforce. I have always known you were there." She stared at him. He held her gaze without flinching, without expression, entirely steady. "You—" She stopped, restarted. "For how long?" "Since the second season." "You never—" "No." "Why?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, "Because you were not hurting anyone. Because the moss was your solution to a problem that should not exist." His eyes were very still on hers. "And because I wanted to know if you would ever choose to come here on your own." The fire breathed between them. The mead jug sat on the table. Outside, the keep was waking. She could hear the first distant sounds of the morning household beginning to move. She stood up. Her arm ached dully. Her wolf was extremely unhelpfully awake. "I should go." "Yes." He stood as well, and she noticed. She kept noticing things about him she had not intended to notice. That he looked tired this morning. Not in the way of a man who slept badly, but in the way of a man who carries a great many things and has been carrying them for a long time. She paused at the door. "The proposal," she said. "The council. Would witnesses help? Someone who could speak to what the bridal moon looks like from inside it?" His eyes sharpened very slightly. "Yes." "Then perhaps," she said carefully, "I could be useful in that capacity." The expression on his face was not something she could name immediately. It took her a moment, walking back through the inner corridor toward the lodge, before she identified it. He had looked, for approximately 3 seconds, like a man who had been holding his breath for a very long time, and had just discovered he could stop. Elder Hakon moved first. Seren should have anticipated it. She had known for years that Hakon was a man who treated omegas the way some men treat land, as something to be managed and made productive. She had simply underestimated how quickly his interest would sharpen once she was visible at court. The summons came through official channels, which was how she knew it was calculated. An elder's official summons to a presenting omega was not technically refusable, which was, she suspected, precisely the point. Hakon's receiving room was full of old wood smoke and colder than it needed to be. Another calculation, she thought. He sat behind a carved desk with the satisfied stillness of a man who expected to be obeyed. "The Stormward Lord has made inquiries," Hakon said, without preamble. "Lord Eirik finds you suitable. He is prepared to formalize a bond proposal through proper channels." A pause that managed to be both gentle and menacing. "This is a significant honor for someone of your pack standing." Seren sat with her hands folded in her lap. "I have not been consulted regarding my suitability." Hakon's expression remained pleasant. "The formalization process includes consultation. You would have the opportunity to decline?" A beat. "To express any concerns, which would be weighed by the council in accordance with tradition. Weighed, she noted. Not honored, not respected. Weighed. I understand, she said. She was at Calder's fire room before the morning was over. He listened without interrupting, standing at the window with his arms crossed, watching the courtyard below with a stillness that she had begun to understand was not distance but containment. Something moved through his jaw when she described Hakon's phrasing, significant honor, weighed, and she watched it and said nothing, because she was getting better at reading the small language of him. When she finished, he turned from the window. His eyes were darker than usual, not color, but quality, the way deep water looks darker than shallow water. He moved faster than I expected, he said. Eric is leaving after the ceremony week ends. Hakon needs to create a commitment before then. Yes. His voice was level. Too level. Lord Eirik has offered Hakon's council a great deal of trade consideration from the Stormward Coast over the past 3 seasons. He looked at her directly. He knew what you were before the ceremony. Someone told him. The cold settled into her differently than cold usually did. Not the clean cold of the cliff face, but something murkier. The healer, Vigdis. No. His mouth tightened fractionally. Vigdis died 3 winters ago, but she was not the only one who knew what ashveil moss is used for. One of the lodge servants, Hakon's eyes are everywhere in this keep. She absorbed this. The old habit of calculation ran through her mind. Exit routes, alternative plans, the logistics of simply leaving. She had done it in her head 100 times over the years. If discovered, go north, cross the Greywash River before the spring thaw, find a settlement small enough not to ask questions. She had never actually gone. She recognized now, with uncomfortable clarity, that she was not certain she could go. What does Eirik want with a Moonfire Omega? She asked. He doesn't know. He can't know what I am. The full bloodline signature is dormant. Calder crossed from the window to the work table, and she saw his hands rest flat against the map surface, a deliberate steadying. He does not need to know the bloodline. He knows only that you are suppressed and hidden, which means you are rare, and that something about your scent, even masked, causes a reaction in alpha wolves that most Omegas don't. He looked up. His wolf is telling him what his mind doesn't have words for. She was very still. What are you going to do? She asked. I am going to call a council session, he said. And I am going to end this negotiation before it begins. His voice had gone to something very flat and very final. The voice, she suspected, of a man who had been patient for a very long time about something and was no longer being patient. And then I am going to pass the consent proposal. Tonight, if I have to stand in front of that council until dawn. She looked at him, at the line of his jaw, the set of his shoulders, the particular tension that lived in him in the way current lives in river water, moving constantly, controlled by the channel it moves through, but always, always there. Calder, she said. His name for the first time, without the title. He went very still. She had not meant to say it, or she had, and had not examined the meaning closely enough. Either way, the name was in the air between them, and she did not take it back. Let me come to the council session, she said. Let me speak. A long pause. His eyes on hers, unreadable except for the dark quality she had learned to recognize as something under pressure. Are you certain? I am very tired, she said honestly, of being a question someone else gets to answer. The corner of his mouth moved, that same almost smile, there and gone. Then come. Elder Hakon had not expected her. That was the thing Seren held on to, walking into the council room with Calder 2 steps ahead of her and the 6 council members arranged around the long table like a jury that had already delivered its verdict. The surprise on Hakon's face, quickly controlled, but not quickly enough, was the only thing she needed to know she was in the right place. She had spent a night preparing her words. She had spent 6 years, in a sense, preparing her words. She spoke without notes, standing at the end of the table, dressed in her plainest wool because she had learned that plain wool did not perform, did not ask for things, could not be accused of trying to sway. She spoke about Astrid, without naming her. She spoke about the shape of a ceremony that dressed necessity as honor and called silence consent. She spoke about the distance between weighing concerns and honoring them. She spoke about ashveil moss and cliff faces at dawn, and what it meant that the only solution she had been able to find for a problem that should not exist was to disappear. The council was quiet. Hakon was not quiet. He spoke when she finished, with the careful precision of a man who knows that visible anger is a tactical mistake. But she could hear the anger underneath it, the particular quality of fury that comes from someone who is accustomed to moving objects and has discovered one that does not move. "The Omega's testimony is noted," he said. "However, the bond protocols have maintained order in this kingdom for—" "The bond protocols," Calder said, "have maintained your interpretation of order." The room went very quiet. He was sitting at the head of the table. He had not raised his voice. He did not raise it now. But something had changed in it. The quality of temperature in a room changes when a fire is built up from banked coals, and that was the closest thing she could find to describe what happened to his voice. Not louder, more. "The proposal has sat before this council for 3 sessions, he said. "In 3 sessions, I have been patient. I have heard arguments. I have revised, reconsidered, compromised on every clause that compromise could serve." His eyes moved around the table. "There is one clause I will not compromise on, that no person under the protection of this kingdom's law may be bonded without her free, stated consent. This is not a radical position. This is the oldest position, that a king protects those in his care." He looked at Hakon, and the look was not unkind, and it was not warm, and it contained something that she suspected was the distillation of a very long patience reaching its absolute limit. "The proposal passes," he said, "with or without the council's vote, under the emergency provision of royal decree. I would prefer the council's vote, but I will not require it." A silence. Hakon sat very still. Then, one by one, 3 council members voted in support, then a 4th, then a 5th, the oldest of them, who had said nothing the entire session, and who voted, Seren thought, with the quiet relief of someone who had been waiting for someone else to move first. Hakon was the last. He looked at Seren, he looked at Calder. Something passed across his face that she could not quite read, the final calculation of a man deciding whether to maintain a position or cut his losses. He voted in support. It passed unanimously. In the corridor outside the council room, Seren stopped walking and stood with her back against the stone wall and simply breathed. The cold air of the corridor found the patch of her bandaged forearm where the cut had begun to heal. Somewhere in the keep, she could hear the morning beginning. Firekeepers, kitchen sounds, the distant low of the stables. She heard his footsteps behind her. "Seren?" She turned around. He was 4 feet away, no closer, and he looked. She looked at him and found that the word she wanted was different. He looked different. The contained quality was still there, would always be there, she suspected. It was simply part of him. But something underneath it was closer to the surface than she had seen it before. "Thank you," she said. He shook his head, a single slight motion. "That was yours. I only provided the room." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about 6 years of pre-dawn harvests and the single night she had not been able to sleep, lying in the lodge room the first night after the ceremony, trying to understand why the King of Veldmark had talked to her like she was a person, and then not been able to stop thinking about it. She thought about the way he had said her name. She thought about his hands on her bandaged arm. "The ashveil compound," she said. "It's almost gone." His eyes were on hers, steady. "I won't need to replace it," she said. Not for the same reason. But I was wondering." She stopped. Started again. "The ceremony week ends in 2 days. After that, I return to the southern tributary pack." A pause that had a quality she had not entirely encountered before. A held breath, she thought. not hers. Yes, he said carefully. I could return to Veldmark, she said, if there were a reason to. The gray of his eyes was very still. There is a council oversight position, he said, with exactly the same careful steadiness, for the new consent protocol. It requires someone who understands the material from the inside. A beat. The position is not ceremonial. I would not accept a ceremonial position. No. And there it was again, that fragment of an almost smile. I did not think you would. She had been in Veldmark 6 weeks when Lord Eirik came back. She had known, in the abstract way that you know winter will come, not the specific day, but the certainty of it. He came with a trade delegation, which was legitimate, and he came with 3 of his own pack's senior alphas, which was noted. And he came directly to the Protocol Oversight Chamber, where Seren was meeting with 2 of the younger council members to discuss implementation language. He waited until the council members had left. You are still here, he said from the doorway. She set down her writing stylus. I am. The king is protective of you. He said it as an observation, without inflection. The council has noticed. The council has a great many things to notice these days. She met his gaze with the same steadiness she had spent years practicing. The oversight work is substantial. Is it the work? He walked into the room, slowly, with the deliberate unhurriedness of a man who was accustomed to the rooms he walks into adjusting themselves to him. Or is it the proximity? She said nothing. This was not, she had found, a situation improved by words. He stopped 3 feet from the table. His eyes were pale gray, colder than Calder's by a quality she felt more than measured. You are not what you have been presenting yourself to be, he said. I have known this since the ceremony hall. Something underneath the mask. He tilted his head slightly. My wolf has been very interested in you, girl. Very insistent. Lord Eirik. The consent protocol is new, he said. The council is new to enforcing it. A man of sufficient standing could argue that the protocol's implementation is still unsettled. A pause. I am a man of considerable standing. The room was cold. She kept her hand still on the table. You are also, said a voice from the doorway, standing in my keep, in front of the chair where my oversight official is sitting, making threats against the law I enacted 3 weeks ago. Eric turned. Calder stood in the doorway. He had arrived. She did not know when, did not know if he had been passing or if something else had drawn him here, and he stood very still in the door frame, and the quality of stillness he possessed had shifted. It was not the stillness of the cliff or the council room. It was the stillness of a moment before something final. His eyes, she saw, were not gray. They were gold. She had read the old pack stories. She knew what it meant. She had known, in some part of herself she had been carefully not examining, that it was coming. Had felt it building like pressure in the days and weeks of the oversight work, in the morning fire room conversations, in the way he always seemed to know when she was in a corridor before she made a sound. She had not known it would happen now, like this, in front of Eric. Eric went very still. Your Majesty, he said carefully. Get out of my keep, Calder said. No particular violence in the words. By sundown. Take your delegation. A pause. And understand that if I receive a report that you have attempted a bond negotiation with any Omega in any territory under my law without her witness consent, you will answer to me personally. Eric held his gaze for a long moment, the particular calculation of an alpha deciding whether the position he has taken is defensible or whether it has become too expensive. Then he inclined his head with the precise minimum of courtesy that acknowledgement required, and left. The sound of his footsteps in the corridor faded. Seren stood up from the chair. Calder was still in the doorway. His eyes were settling. She watched them, unable to look away, the gold warming and shifting like metal cooling in a mold, finding its final form. When he looked at her, it was with the full force of something that had been held at a very careful distance for a very long time, and had just, finally stop being held. Seren. Her name and his voice had a different quality now, something underneath it that she felt in her sternum, her wrists, the place at the base of her throat where the ashveil compound used to sit. Her wolf was on her feet, had been, she realized, since the gold appeared in his eyes. "I know what this is," she said. Her voice was remarkably steady. "Yes. I need you to know something first." She crossed the room to him, stopping an arm's length away, and looked up at his face. His jaw was set. His eyes were gold and direct, and entirely, irrevocably known to her in a way she was still learning the full dimensions of. "I am not going to let anyone, any person, any ceremony, any protocol, make this into something I didn't choose." Her voice didn't waver. Not even the bond. He held her gaze without flinching. "I know." "I am choosing it," she said. "I want you to understand that. The difference." Something moved through his face. Something vast and quiet, like a continental shift expressed in the movement of a single muscle at the corner of his mouth. "I know the difference," he said. "I have been waiting for it." She reached up and pressed her palm flat against his chest, felt the strong, rapid beat of his heart under her hand, faster than she would have expected from him, this contained and controlled man, faster than his face showed. She felt her own wolf surge, not against anything, not toward escape, but forward, toward something she had been circling at a careful distance for months. "Then wait a little longer," she said, "until I ask." He covered her hand with his, warm and steady and careful. "As long as you need," he said. "However long." The first snow of the season came in the night, and Seren woke to a world turned quiet. She lay still for a moment in the dark of her room in the keep, her room now, not the ceremony lodge. The oversight position had changed that months ago, and listened to the specific silence that snow makes, the way it absorbs sound and returns a different kind of stillness. Her wolf stretched at the base of her mind, slow and satisfied, and she let her. She had stopped fighting her wolf. She had realized, sometime in the weeks between the council session and the first snowfall, that the fight had never really been with her wolf. Her wolf had known, with the clear animal wisdom of things that live close to instinct, what the danger was and what it was not. The fight had been with the fear that something beautiful could become what she had watched happen to Astrid in the old hall, that desire could be used against you, that the thing your body reached for could be turned into a sentence. Calder had not turned it into a sentence. He had not, in 3 months of fireside mornings, and corridor conversations, and council chambers, and the quiet particular way he looked at her across a room, he had not once taken from her anything she had not offered. He had been, with the precise and unflinching care of a man who understood the stakes, patient. She had tested it, because she could not help testing it. She had pulled back in moments when connection threatened to become comfortable, had been quieter, had been cooler, had watched to see if his patience had conditions. It did not. He had simply continued to be present, to make the fire room available, to say her name with the same quality of attention, whether she had been warm the day before or not. She had learned, slowly, that some things are what they are even when you test them. She found him on the upper path above the eastern cliff. He was standing where she had first looked up and seen him against the sky. The same position, the same stillness, the same dark outline against gray. He turned when he heard her footsteps on the stone, and she watched his face find her and settle, the small unconscious change that happened in him when she arrived anywhere he was. She had learned to read that, too. Snow had begun again overnight, soft and sideways, and it caught in his dark hair and on the shoulders of his heavy winter cloak. The cliff face below them was white and silent. Somewhere below, in the rock shelf where the ashveil grew, the moss would be covered until spring. She did not need it anymore. She had thought this would feel like loss, the abandonment of the strategy that had kept her safe for 6 years. Instead, it felt like putting down something very heavy that she had been carrying for so long she had forgotten it was heavy. "I owe you something," she said. She stopped beside him at the cliff's edge and looked at the valley below, white and still. "An answer to a question you never asked." He waited. You asked me in the council session. Or rather, you didn't ask, but you wanted to know why I chose the cliff face over the other options. She kept her eyes on the valley. The suppressant herbs leave a trace. The wolfsbane suppressants were what everyone expected, the obvious choice. And I didn't want to be obvious. I wanted to be invisible. But I think there was something else. She turned to look at him. He was watching her with the steady, unhurried quality that was simply his nature. The ashveil grows here because this territory is old, she said. Because it absorbs the signature of whoever claims it. She looked at the cliff face below them, at the place where the silver-green moss would be sleeping under the snow. I've thought about this for months. My wolf was drawn here before I knew what she was drawn to. I told myself it was the practical option, but I think she was already... She stopped. He said nothing. He did not finish the sentence for her. She was already finding her way to where she needed to be, Seren finished, quietly. The snow fell between them, soft and indifferent. Seren, he said. Yes. I am going to ask you something. His voice was very steady, the particular steadiness of a man who has been rehearsing this moment, not the words of it, but the weight of it, carrying it for a long time and now finally setting it down. And I need you to know that whatever the answer is, nothing changes between us. She looked at him directly. The snow had settled on his shoulders, on the dark braids of his hair, along the line of his jaw. His eyes were gold. They had been gold for 3 months now, settled into their new color like a fire that has found its proper fuel and does not intend to go out. Ask, she said. Will you let me? He did not elaborate. He did not need to. The bond question had only one shape. On your own terms, in your own time, only when you want it. She held his gaze for a long time. She thought of the girl who had pressed herself behind a cracked pillar in an old hall and made a vow to herself out of fear. She thought of what it had taken to get from that girl to this cliff edge, the cold mornings, the careful calculations, the years of making herself invisible so she could stay intact. She thought of what Calder had said in the fire room months ago. There is a difference between a choice made freely and a choice made because all other options have been removed. She lifted her hand and pressed her palm against his chest, the same gesture she had made the day of the council corridor, and she felt, as she had felt then, the strong and unmistakable evidence of his heartbeat. Yes, she said. His exhale was slow, warm in the cold air. He raised his hand to her face, careful as always so careful, and she turned into it before he could hesitate, pressing her cheek against his palm and letting herself feel the warmth of him without pulling back. Now? He asked, quietly. Now, she said. The bond settled into place, not like a lock clicking shut, but like a river finding its valley, not a new thing, but the completion of something that had always been moving toward this. His forehead came to rest against hers. Below them, the valley held its snow silence. Above, the sky was the particular pale gray of winter mornings that hold every possibility for the day ahead. She had spent 6 years making herself invisible. She let herself be seen. Some bonds are not written in ceremony. They are written in cliff faces and dawn harvests and the kind of patience that has learned to hold its breath. They are written in the space between asking and answering, where the heart discovers it is no longer afraid. What the moon writes in breath and blood shall be made whole, but only when it is chosen,